It was a warm April evening in Los Angeles, the kind where the sun dips behind the hills just right and leaves the sky painted in soft oranges and purples. The city hummed with its usual rhythm, cars gliding down Sunset Boulevard, tourists snapping photos outside famous studios, and palm trees swaying like they'd seen it all before. Inside the ABC studio on Hollywood Boulevard, things were buzzing with a different kind of energy. Crew members darted around, adjusting lights, testing microphones, and double-checking cue cards. In just a few hours, Jimmy Kimmel Live would go on air, and tonight's guest was someone the team had been quietly excited about for weeks. Keanu Reeves. Keanu wasn't the kind of celebrity who showed up with a big entourage or demanded a dressing room full of specific snacks and flowers. He arrived alone, wearing a simple black jacket, dark jeans, and the same calm expression people had come to recognize from red carpets and movie posters. He greeted everyone by name, even the new intern, and asked if anyone needed help carrying anything. That was just how he was. No fuss, no ego, just a guy who happened to be one of the most beloved actors in the world. Backstage, he sat quietly in the green room, sipping water and flipping through a worn copy of a philosophy book he'd carried for years. He'd been doing press for his latest film, a quiet, thoughtful drama about second chances, and while he enjoyed talking about the work, he always braced himself for the personal questions. Not because he was rude or secretive, but because some parts of his life still felt too tender to share out loud, especially on live television. One of those parts was his father. Samuel Reeves had walked out of Keanu's life before he could even remember what it felt like to be held by him. Keanu was only 3 years old. His mother, Patricia, had packed up their lives in Beirut and moved them across the world, to New York, then Toronto, doing whatever she could to give her kids stability. She worked odd jobs, sometimes 3 at once, and never complained. She filled their home with music, books, and laughter, doing her best to make up for the silence left behind by a man who chose to disappear. Over the years, Keanu learned to live with that absence. He didn't talk about it much. Not in interviews, not even with close friends. It wasn't shame. It was more like a quiet ache he'd learned to carry without letting it slow him down. He'd built a life on kindness, hard work, and showing up for people, maybe because he knew what it felt like when someone didn't show up for you. The producers had promised this interview would be light. Just fun stories from the set, maybe a joke or two about motorcycles or that time he gave away most of his Matrix paycheck. Keanu had agreed, relieved. He liked Jimmy Kimmel. The host had a way of making guests feel at ease, and he never pushed too hard. Still, as Keanu waited for his cue, a small knot formed in his stomach. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was just nerves. Or maybe, deep down, he sensed something was about to shift. Jimmy, meanwhile, was reviewing his notes in his office. He'd done his homework. He knew Keanu rarely spoke about his childhood. He also knew that in recent years, Keanu had started opening up just a little, mentioning his sister's battle with leukemia, his grief over losing his partner and their stillborn daughter, the way loss had shaped him. But his father? Never. Not once in over 30 years of interviews. Still, Jimmy didn't plan to ambush him. He wasn't that kind of interviewer. But he'd scribbled one gentle question near the bottom of his notepad. Your characters often carry quiet pain. Do you think your own life has taught you how to understand that? He wasn't sure he'd even ask it. He'd wait and see how the conversation flowed. If Keanu seemed open, maybe they'd go there. If not, they'd stick to talking about stunt work and his love for chess. Out in the audience, people chatted excitedly, clutching tickets like they'd won the lottery. He's so normal, one woman whispered to her friend. Like he could be your neighbor who fixes your bike. Another nodded. But he's been through so much. I just hope he's okay. There was a real fondness in the room, not the screaming, starstruck kind, but something warmer, more protective. People didn't just admire Keanu. They rooted for him. Backstage, Keanu took a deep breath. He thought about his mom. She'd be proud of him, he knew. She always told him to be good, be kind, and keep going. He thought about his sister, Kim, who'd fought so hard and inspired him every day. And then, unbidden, a memory flickered, just a fragment. A man's voice. A hand on his shoulder. Or maybe that was just his imagination filling in the blanks. He shook his head gently as if to clear the fog. A stagehand knocked softly on the door. 5 minutes, Mr. Reeves. Keanu stood, smoothed his jacket, and gave a small nod. Thanks. He walked down the hallway toward the stage, his footsteps quiet on the carpet. The murmur of the audience grew louder as he approached. He could hear Jimmy warming them up, telling a joke that made everyone laugh. For a moment, Keanu paused just out of sight, watching through the crack in the curtain. The lights were bright, the set colorful, the whole scene full of life. It felt safe, friendly. He reminded himself this was just a conversation, not a confession, not a reckoning. Just two people talking, but life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. As he stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause, Keanu smiled. That familiar, slightly shy smile that had charmed millions. He shook Jimmy's hand, waved to the crowd, and settled into the guest chair. The interview began exactly as planned. They talked about the new movie. Keanu shared a funny story about getting lost on set. He made everyone laugh with his dry wit. He seemed relaxed, present, happy, even. And then, about 10 minutes in, Jimmy leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. You know, he said, in so many of your roles, Ted, Neo, John Wick, you play men who've lost something, or someone, and they keep going even when it hurts. Where does that come from for you? Keanu looked down for a second, then back up. His smile didn't fade, but it changed, became quieter, more thoughtful. I guess I've known loss, he said simply. The audience grew still, not out of discomfort, but out of respect. They could feel something real happening. Jimmy didn't rush. He just waited. And that's when Keanu did something he'd never done before on camera. He mentioned his father. Just a few words, barely a sentence, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. And in that moment, everything changed. The studio lights felt suddenly brighter, or maybe it was just the silence that made everything seem sharper. Keanu had just said it, those few quiet words about his dad not being around, and now the air had changed. It wasn't awkward exactly, more like the room had taken a breath and held it, waiting to see what came next. Jimmy didn't jump in right away. He just looked at Keanu with the kind of understanding that doesn't need words. He'd interviewed thousands of people over the years, comedians, politicians, movie stars, but he knew this wasn't a moment for a joke or a quick pivot. This was something deeper, something real. Keanu sat back slightly in his chair, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He wasn't looking at the audience anymore. His eyes were fixed on some middle distance, like he was seeing something far away. Maybe a memory. Maybe a question he'd carried for decades. He left when I was really young, Keanu continued, his voice low but clear. 3 years old. I don't really remember him. He paused, swallowed. My mom raised us. Me and my sister. She did everything. Worked all the time. Moved us around a lot. But she never made us feel like we were missing anything. She filled our lives with so much love. A few people in the audience nodded softly. Someone wiped their eye. Jimmy leaned forward just a little. Did you ever hear from him after he left? Keanu shook his head slowly. Not for a long time, years, then letters sometimes. Phone calls once or twice. But it was never consistent. Never enough to build anything on. He gave a small, sad smile. I think I kept hoping for a while that one day he'd show up and it would all make sense. Like maybe he had a good reason. Maybe he was sorry. Maybe he wanted to try again. He stopped there, but his eyes said more. They said how that hope had slowly faded, how he'd learned to stop waiting, how he'd built a life without that piece of the puzzle. And yet somehow, the missing piece still left a shape in his chest. Jimmy didn't push. He just said gently, "That's a lot for a kid to carry." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, but you learn to carry it. You don't have a choice, really." He looked down at his hands, then back up. What's harder is not knowing why. You ask yourself 1,000 times, was it me? Was I not enough? Did I do something wrong? Even when you know logically that a 3-year-old can't be the reason a grown man walks away. Your heart doesn't always listen to logic. His voice started to waver just a little, not dramatically, just enough that you could hear the effort it took to keep going. I spent years trying not to think about it, he said, focused on work, on friends, on being there for the people who were in my life. And that helped. It really did. But every now and then, something would happen. A birthday, a movie premiere, a quiet moment at home, and I'd wonder, what would it be like if he was here? Would he be proud? Would we even know how to talk to each other? He took a breath, and this time it hitched just slightly, but enough that Jimmy noticed. The host's expression softened even more. He didn't reach for a tissue yet. He didn't interrupt. He just let Keanu be where he was. I found out he passed away a couple years ago, Keanu said quietly. I didn't go to the funeral. I don't know if that makes me a bad son or just someone who never got the chance to be a son in the first place. Now his voice really cracked. Not loud, not messy, but raw. Honest. The kind of crack that comes when you've held something in for so long that your body finally says, enough. Tears filled his eyes, not streaming down his face, but glistening, trembling on the edge of falling. He blinked quickly, trying to steady himself, but another came. And another. He looked at Jimmy, almost apologetically, like he was embarrassed for losing control in front of so many people. But Jimmy just gave him a small, reassuring nod as if to say, it's okay. You're safe here. That's when Keanu whispered the words that would stay with everyone in the room. I never got to ask him why. And with that, the dam broke. Not in a flood, but in a quiet, steady release. A single tear rolled down his cheek. Then another.
He didn't sob.
He didn't hide his face. He just sat there, letting himself feel it in front of millions of people who had only ever seen him as strong, composed, untouchable. The audience didn't cheer. They didn't gasp. They sat in complete, respectful silence. Some had tears in their own eyes. Others held hands with the person next to them. It wasn't about entertainment anymore. It was about witnessing something human, something true. Backstage, the producer watching the monitor froze mid-sip of coffee. The camera operators held their shots steady, careful not to zoom in too much, giving Keanu space even through the lens. Everyone knew this wasn't part of the script. This was real life unfolding live. Jimmy finally reached over and placed a box of tissues on the small table between them. He didn't hand one to Keanu. He just made it available, letting him choose when or if he wanted to take one. Keanu looked at the box, then back at Jimmy. He gave a tiny, grateful nod. He took a tissue, dabbed his eyes gently, and tried to smile. It was shaky but real. Sorry, he murmured. Don't be, Jimmy said softly. There's nothing to be sorry for. Keanu nodded again, taking a few slow breaths. He seemed to be gathering himself, not to shut down the emotion, but to honor it without letting it overwhelm him. That was who he was. Even in vulnerability, there was dignity. I've never said any of that out loud before, he admitted. Not like this. Not on camera. I don't know why it came out tonight. Maybe it was because Jimmy had asked with kindness, not curiosity. Maybe it was because the world felt heavy lately, and even the strongest people need to let go sometimes. Or maybe after all these years, his heart had finally decided it was safe to speak. Whatever the reason, the moment had happened, and it couldn't be undone. Jimmy let the silence sit for a beat longer, not to make it dramatic, but to let it breathe. Then gently he said, "Thank you for trusting us with that." Keanu looked out at the audience then, really looked at them. Not as fans, but as people who might understand. If anyone out there is carrying something like this, he said, his voice stronger now, know that you're not alone, and it's okay to feel it. It doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. The audience didn't applaud right away. They just looked at him with so much warmth and respect that it felt like a kind of quiet standing ovation. But then, as if sensing Keanu needed a moment, Jimmy smoothly shifted the conversation. "You know," he said with just the right touch of lightness, "I heard you actually learned to play the bass guitar for a role once and then kept playing it for years after." "True?" Keanu blinked, surprised by the change but grateful. He took another breath, wiped his eyes one last time, and nodded. "Yeah, music helps. It always has." And just like that, the conversation began to find its way back to safer ground. But the air in the room was different now, lighter in a strange way, like something heavy had been shared and in the sharing made a little easier to carry. Still, Keanu's hands trembled slightly as he talked about his love for music. His voice was calm, but his body hadn't fully settled. The emotion was still there, just beneath the surface, like a river that had overflowed its banks and was now slowly returning to its course. As the interview continued, people in the audience exchanged glances. No one was checking their phones. No one was whispering. Everyone was present, because they'd just seen something rare. A man known for playing heroes finally letting the world see his own quiet wound. And in that moment, He wasn't Neo or John Wick or even Keanu Reeves. Movie star. He was just a son who never got the answers he needed, and somehow that made him more heroic than any role he'd ever played. The interview kept going, but nothing felt quite the same after that moment. Keanu answered Jimmy's questions about music, about his latest film, even joked about how he still couldn't parallel park properly. But his mind wasn't fully in the conversation. It was like part of him was still back in that quiet space where he'd finally said out loud what he'd buried for decades. The words had left his lips and now they were out in the world, real and unchangeable. He couldn't take them back. And maybe deep down he didn't want to. Still, as the minutes passed, the weight in his chest didn't lift. If anything, it grew heavier. Every laugh felt a little forced. Every smile took a little more effort. He kept glancing toward the edge of the stage where the bright lights faded into shadow. It wasn't that he wanted to run away. He just needed air, space, a moment to breathe without 1,000 eyes watching. Jimmy noticed. He always did. He'd been doing this long enough to read the subtle signs, the slight tension in someone's shoulders, the way their eyes darted just a little too often toward the exit. So when Keanu paused mid-sentence, his voice trailing off as he stared at his hands, Jimmy didn't push. He just gave a small understanding nod. "You know what?" Jimmy said gently, turning slightly toward the audience. "I think we're going to take a quick break. Keanu's been incredibly generous with us tonight, and I think we all need a minute to just sit with what he shared." The audience didn't cheer. They didn't clap loudly. They just murmured in quiet agreement, some nodding, others wiping their eyes again. It wasn't a commercial break. It felt more like a collective breath. As the red on-air light switched off, Keanu stood up slowly. He didn't say anything. He just gave Jimmy a look that said everything. "Thank you. I need a second." Jimmy patted his arm lightly and whispered, "Take all the time you need." Keanu walked off stage, not fast, not slow, just steady. The moment he stepped behind the curtain, the noise of the studio faded. The chatter of the crew, the hum of the lights, the distant sound of the audience, it all blurred into a soft background hum. He kept walking past the dressing rooms, past the snack table, until he found a quiet hallway near the loading dock. There, under a dim overhead light, he leaned against the cool cinder block wall and closed his eyes. He wasn't sobbing. He wasn't falling apart, but his whole body felt like it had been unplugged from something it had been holding on to for years. His hands trembled slightly. His breath came in shallow waves. He pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes, trying to steady himself. It wasn't shame he felt. It was something deeper. Relief, maybe. Or exhaustion. Like he'd been carrying a backpack full of stones his whole life, and had just set it down without realizing how heavy it really was. A stagehand passed by, saw him, and immediately turned around without saying a word. Someone else brought a bottle of water and left it on a nearby crate, then walked away. No one asked if he was okay. No one demanded an explanation. They just gave him space, and for that he was grateful. Back in the studio, Jimmy stayed seated, speaking softly to the audience during the break. "What Keanu shared tonight, it takes real courage," he said. "Most of us have things we don't talk about, things we keep locked away because they hurt too much or feel too private. But sometimes just saying them out loud, it helps. Not because it fixes everything, but because it reminds us we're not alone." The audience listened quietly. Some people held hands. Others sat with their heads bowed, thinking of their own losses, their own unanswered questions. Meanwhile, Keanu opened his eyes and looked down at the floor. He thought about his mother, how she'd never spoken badly about his father even when she had every right to. "People do the best they can with what they've got," she used to say. He thought about his sister, who'd faced her own battles with such grace. And he thought about all the times he'd played characters who found peace after pain, and how in real life peace wasn't a destination. It was a daily choice. He picked up the water bottle, took a slow sip, and let the cool liquid calm his throat. His heart was still racing, but it was slowing now. He wasn't broken. He was just human. After a few more minutes, a producer approached cautiously. "Keanu, we're ready whenever you are." "No pressure. We can wrap early if you'd like." Keanu shook his head. "No, I'll go back. I want to finish." He wasn't running from it. He'd said what he needed to say, and now he wanted to be present for the rest of the night. Not as someone hiding, but as someone who'd just shown a part of himself he usually kept hidden. He walked back toward the stage, his steps firmer this time, As he passed the curtain, he heard Jimmy telling a light-hearted story about getting lost in Tokyo, and the audience laughing softly. It felt good to hear laughter again. It reminded him that life wasn't just pain, it was also joy, connection, small moments of light. He stepped back onto the set. The audience rose to their feet, not in a roaring standing ovation, but in a quiet, respectful show of support. No one shouted. No one whistled. They just stood, looking at him with kindness in their eyes. Keanu gave a small wave, touched by the gesture, and sat back down. Jimmy smiled. "Welcome back," Keanu nodded. "Thanks for giving me a minute." "Of course," Jimmy said. Then after a pause, "You okay?" Keanu thought about it. Not the polite "I'm fine" answer. The real one. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I am. It just hit me harder than I expected." "That's fair," Jimmy replied. "Some things live deeper than we realize." They didn't dive back into heavy topics. Instead, they talked about Keanu's love for motorcycles, how he still rides his own bike around the city, how he once fixed a stranger's flat tire on the side of the road. The conversation flowed easily, warmly, but now even the light moments felt richer, because everyone knew there was depth beneath them. At one point, Keanu mentioned how he'd started volunteering at a community center that helped kids with absent parents. Not to fix anything, he explained. Just to be there, to show them they matter even if someone walked away. Jimmy nodded. "That's the kind of thing that changes lives." "Maybe," Keanu said softly. "Or maybe it just helps me feel like I'm turning something painful into something useful." The audience listened, not as fans but as fellow travelers on this messy, beautiful journey called life. By the time the interview ended, the mood in the studio had shifted, not back to normal but to something new, something tender and honest. As Keanu stood to leave, the audience gave him another quiet round of applause, not for his fame but for his honesty. He walked off stage again, but this time, his shoulders were straighter. His eyes were clear. He hadn't solved the mystery of his father. He hadn't healed every wound, but he'd done something powerful. He'd let himself feel it, and he'd let others see it, and in that moment, he wasn't alone anymore. The moment Keanu stepped off stage for the second time, the energy around him changed. It wasn't just the quiet respect from the crew or the gentle nods from the staff. It was something deeper, like the air itself had softened. He walked slowly down the hallway, not heading anywhere in particular, just needing to move to let his body catch up with everything his heart had just released. His jacket felt heavier than usual, or maybe it was just the weight of having spoken a truth he'd carried in silence for over 40 years. Back in the control room, the director watched the monitors with a rare stillness. Normally, after a taping, there'd be chatter about timing, lighting, whether a joke landed. But tonight, no one spoke for a full minute after the final camera cut. Someone finally whispered, "That was real," and that was enough. No one felt the need to add more. Jimmy stayed on set for a while, answering a few quiet questions from the audience, but his mind kept drifting back to Keanu's words. He'd interviewed world leaders, comedians who could make a room explode with laughter, and actors who could cry on command. But what he'd just witnessed wasn't performance. It was raw, unguarded humanity, and he knew, without a doubt, that this moment needed to stay in the final cut, not for ratings, not for headlines, but because it mattered. Later in his office, Jimmy sat alone with his notes. He flipped to the page with his original question about pain and absence. He hadn't planned for it to go this far, but now, looking back, he realized Keanu hadn't just answered the question. He'd given something far more valuable: permission. Permission to feel. Permission to not have all the answers. Permission to be broken and still be whole. He picked up the phone and called the head of production. "We're airing the full segment," he said. "No edits, no cuts. Just as it happened." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure? It's intense." "I'm sure," Jimmy replied. "People need to hear this." Meanwhile, Keanu had found a quiet corner near the back exit, a small alcove with a bench and a view of the parking lot. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from a nearby garden. He sat down, elbows on his knees, staring at the ground. His hands had stopped shaking, but his mind was still racing, replaying every word, every breath, every tear. He thought about how strange it was that something so private could happen in front of so many people. He'd spent most of his life protecting his inner world, not out of pride, but because it felt too fragile to share. And yet tonight he'd opened the door just a crack. And instead of judgment, he'd been met with silence that felt like kindness. A security guard walked by, saw him, and slowed his pace. "You all right, Mr. Reeves?" he asked, voice low. Keanu looked up and offered a small, tired smile. "Yeah, just thinking," the guard nodded. "Take your time." No rush. He didn't linger, didn't pry, just kept walking, giving Keanu the space he needed. That small act of respect meant more than the man probably realized. In a world where celebrities were often treated like products or puzzles to be solved, being seen simply as a person, tired, emotional, human, was a rare gift. After a while, Keanu stood up and walked back inside.
He didn't go to the green room.
Instead, he headed to the editing bay, where a few crew members were already reviewing footage. They looked up when he entered, unsure what to say. "I just wanted to see," he started, then paused. "I wanted to make sure it's okay. What I said, if it's too much." One of the editors, a woman who'd worked on the show for over a decade, met his eyes. "It's not too much," she said gently. "It's exactly enough," Keanu swallowed. "I've never done anything like that before." "You didn't have to," she replied. "But you did, and that's why it matters." He stayed for a few minutes, watching a playback of the moment, not to critique it, but to understand it. Seeing himself on screen, voice breaking, eyes wet with tears, was strange. He almost didn't recognize the man in the chair. But then he realized that was him, not the movie star, not the internet's favorite nice guy, just a son who never got to say goodbye or hello or ask the one question that haunted him his whole life. He thanked the team and headed out. His car was waiting, but he asked the driver to give him a minute. He stood on the sidewalk for a while, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Los Angeles at night was never truly quiet, but in that moment it felt peaceful. When he finally got in the car, he didn't speak. He just leaned his head against the window and let the motion of the drive soothe him. His phone buzzed once, his agent checking in, but he didn't answer. He knew what they'd say. "Are you okay? Do you need to issue a statement? Should we prepare for media fallout?" But there was no fallout. There was only truth. Back at his apartment, he poured a glass of water and sat on the couch. The place was simple. Wood floors, bookshelves filled with dog-eared paperbacks, a single framed photo of his sister on the mantel. No flashy art, no designer furniture, just a home. He thought about calling his mom. She was in her 80s now, living quietly in Canada. She'd always been his anchor. But it was late, and he didn't want to worry her. She'd see the episode soon enough, and when she did, he knew she'd understand. She'd lived through it all, the leaving, the moving, the rebuilding. She'd never asked for pity. She just kept going. And in many ways, he was her son through and through. He turned on the TV not to watch himself, but to hear something else. Anything else. A nature documentary came on, showing wolves moving through a snowy forest. He watched them silently, drawn to their quiet strength, the way they moved as a pack looking out for one another. It struck him then. Maybe that's what tonight had been about. Not just grief, but connection. By sharing his pain, he'd reached out a hand without even meaning to, and others had reached back. Not to fix him, but to say, "Well, me too." He turned off the TV and sat in the dark for a long time. No music, no distractions, just stillness. The next morning, he woke early. Sunlight streamed through the blinds. He made coffee, fed his dog, and checked his phone. Dozens of messages, some from friends, some from people he hadn't heard from in years. All of them kind. All of them saying some version of, "Thank you for being real." He didn't respond to most of them right away, but he read every single one. Later that day, he went for a walk in the hills above the city. The air was crisp, the trails quiet. As he walked, he thought about what came next. He wasn't sure, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he had to have all the answers. He just had to keep walking, and that was enough. The episode aired on a Thursday night, just like any other. But this time, something was different. People weren't just tuning in for jokes or movie gossip. They were watching because they'd heard whispers. A quiet rumor had spread online. Keanu said something real, something you've never heard before. By the time the show started, the live stream was unusually full. Not with the usual chatter, but with a kind of hushed anticipation. When the moment came, the part where his voice broke, where he whispered, I never got to ask him why. The internet didn't explode with memes or hot takes. Instead, something quieter happened. People paused their TVs, they texted friends, "Are you watching this?" They sat with their families in silence. And when it was over, they didn't rush to post. They just felt it. By morning, social media was filled, not with gossip, but with stories. Thousands of people shared their own experiences. Parents who left, letters never sent, questions that would never be answered. One person wrote, "I've carried this shame for 30 years like it was my fault. Seeing him say it out loud made me cry, and then breathe for the first time in forever." Another posted, "My dad walked out when I was 5. I always thought I was the only one who still wondered, was I not enough? Thank you, Keanu, for making me feel less alone." News outlets covered it, but not in a sensational way. Headlines read things like "A moment of shared humanity," or "When a movie star showed us his heart." Even critics who usually focused on box office numbers or fashion choices wrote about how rare it was to see such unguarded honesty on television. Keanu didn't do interviews the next day. He didn't post anything online. He just went about his life, walking his dog, stopping to talk to a neighbor fixing their fence, buying coffee for the barista who looked exhausted. But now when people recognized him, they didn't ask for selfies. They just smiled and said, "Thank you." And he always nodded, sometimes with a quiet "You're welcome," other times just with his eyes. A few weeks later, he was spotted at a community center on the east side of the city, not for a photo op, but because he'd been volunteering there quietly for months. He helped set up chairs for a support group for kids with absent parents. He didn't speak much. He just listened. When a teenager asked him how he dealt with never knowing why his dad left, Keanu didn't offer easy answers. He just said, "I stopped waiting for a reason. I started focusing on the people who stayed. That's where I found my peace." The group facilitator later said it was the first time some of those kids had seen an adult talk about loss without trying to fix it or sugarcoat it. He didn't say, "It'll get better," she recalled. He said, "It's okay to carry it. Just don't let it be the only thing you carry." Around the same time, a small nonprofit that supported children in unstable homes received an anonymous donation large enough to keep their doors open for another year. The note attached simply read, "For the kids who wonder why." No name. But everyone knew. Keanu never confirmed it was him. He didn't need to. Months passed. The world kept turning. New movies came out, new scandals flared, new headlines grabbed attention. But that one moment on Jimmy Kimmel's show didn't fade. It became a reference point, a quiet landmark in the culture. Teachers used it in classrooms to talk about emotional honesty. Therapists mentioned it in sessions. Parents showed it to their teenagers and said, "It's okay to feel this way." And Keanu? He kept working. He filmed another movie, this time playing a quiet school teacher who helps a troubled student find their voice. When asked in a later interview if the role felt personal, he just smiled and said, "All the roles are personal in some way. We bring our lives to the work." He never went back on Jimmy Kimmel Live. Not because it was painful, but because that moment had served its purpose. It wasn't about repeating it, it was about living beyond it. One evening he visited his mother. She was sitting on her porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching the sunset. She didn't mention the interview right away. She just handed him a cup of tea and said, "You look lighter." He sat beside her. "I feel lighter," he admitted. She nodded. "You carried that for a long time. Longer than you needed to." "I didn't know how to put it down," he said. "You didn't have to put it down," she replied gently. "You just had to stop holding it so tight." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn pink and gold. No grand speeches. No dramatic confessions. Just two people who'd been through a lot, finally at peace with what they couldn't change. Later, as he drove back to the city, Keanu rolled down his window and let the cool night air fill the car. He thought about all the messages he'd received, the ones from strangers who said his words helped them call their own parents, or finally forgive themselves, or just cry without shame. He hadn't set out to inspire anyone. He'd just been honest. And somehow that honesty had rippled outward in ways he never expected. He knew his father was gone. There would be no reunion, No apology, no final conversation, but in a strange way, saying those words out loud had given him something almost as powerful. Closure not from the other person, but from himself. He'd faced the wound, named it, and chosen not to let it define him anymore. Back home, he opened his journal, the same one he'd kept for years, and wrote just a few lines. Today, I stopped running from the silence, and in the quiet, I found my voice. He closed the book and turned off the light. The story didn't end with a big finale or a perfect resolution. Life rarely does. But it ended with something quieter and maybe more meaningful. A man who had spent decades carrying a question finally learning to live with the space it left behind, not as an empty hole, but as room for something new. Kindness, connection, peace, and in the end, that was enough. The story was never supposed to have a sixth part. 5 felt complete, like a quiet arc that began in silence, broke open in tears, and settled into something softer, something whole. But life doesn't always follow neat chapters. Sometimes, long after you think the page has turned, a new sentence appears. Not loud, not dramatic, just true. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, months after the interview aired. Keanu was in a small town outside Portland, visiting a youth center that had reached out after seeing the episode. He wasn't there as a celebrity. He'd asked them not to announce his visit, not to prepare anything special. He just wanted to sit with the kids, listen, maybe share a meal. The center served children from broken homes, some with parents in prison, others with parents lost to addiction, many with no parents at all. He arrived in a plain hoodie and jeans, carrying a backpack with books he'd picked up at a used bookstore the day before. No cameras, no handlers, just him and a thermos of coffee. Inside, the room was full of noise. Laughter, arguments over board games, the clatter of lunch trays. When he walked in, a few kids recognized him and froze mid-sentence. One boy dropped his spoon. But Keanu didn't wave or pose. He just smiled and said, "Hey, mind if I join?" They made space for him at a table near the window. A girl with braids and paint-stained fingers slid a chair out for him without saying a word. He sat down, poured himself a cup of weak cafeteria coffee, and asked what they were working on. "Art project," she said, nodding to a bulletin board covered in drawings. "We're making maps of our hearts." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Your hearts?" Rissy, another kid, chimed in, a boy no older than 10. "Like the places inside us that hurt, and the places that feel safe." Keanu looked at the board. One drawing showed a dark cave labeled, "When Dad Left." Another had a bright yellow house marked, "Grandma's Kitchen." A third was just a question mark with the words, "Why didn't they stay?" He felt that familiar tug in his chest, not pain exactly, but recognition. Like seeing a reflection he hadn't expected. He stayed for hours. He didn't give advice. He didn't tell them everything would be okay. Instead, he listened. He heard about missed birthdays, empty chairs at school plays, the way silence could feel louder than shouting. And when one boy asked, "Do you ever stop wondering?" Keanu didn't lie. "No," he said. "But you learn to wonder less. You fill your life with people who show up. That helps." Later, as he helped clean up, the center's director pulled him aside. "You don't know what this means to them," she said quietly. "To see someone like you, someone the whole world looks up to, say it's okay to not be okay. It changes how they see themselves." Keanu shook his head. "I'm not special. I just got tired of pretending." That night, back in his hotel room, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the boy with the question mark on his heart map. It reminded him of himself at that age, always searching for a reason, a pattern, a sign that he'd been loved enough to stay. But something had shifted since the interview. It wasn't that the wound had healed, it was that he'd stopped treating it like a secret. And in doing so, he'd given others permission to do the same. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at his office. It wasn't from a fan club or a studio. It was handwritten, on lined notebook paper sealed with a sticker of a rocket ship. Inside, a child's careful printing read, "Dear Mr. Reeves, my dad left when I was 4. I used to think it was because I cried too much. But after I saw you on TV, I asked my mom if it was my fault. She said no, she cried too. We hugged for a long time. Thank you for helping us talk." Liam, age 9, Keanu read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the same drawer where he kept letters from his sister, old photos, and the ticket stub from his first theater audition. He didn't write back right away. But a month later, a package arrived at Liam's school. Inside was a beginner's bass guitar, a set of lessons printed neatly on clean paper, and a note that said, "Music helped me find my voice when words weren't enough." Maybe it'll help you too. No signature. Just a small doodle of a heart with a question mark inside, and a sun rising beside it. Word of the gift spread quietly through the school, not as gossip, but as hope. Other kids started asking counselors about music programs. A local teacher started an after-school band. None of it was because of fame or money. It was because one honest moment had sparked a chain of small human connections. Back in Los Angeles, Keanu returned to his routine, walking his dog, riding his motorcycle through the hills, stopping to help strangers when he saw someone in need. But now, when people approached him, they didn't just ask for autographs. Sometimes they'd say, "My dad left too," and he'd pause, look them in the eye, and say, "I know." And that was enough. He never made a big speech about it, never launched a foundation or wrote a memoir. He just kept showing up in ways both seen and unseen. He funded music rooms in 3 more youth centers. He quietly paid off medical bills for a single mother who'd written him a letter. He visited a veterans group where men and women shared stories of abandonment, not just by parents, but by systems, by promises, by time. Through it all, he remained the same person, kind, grounded, never drawing attention to his actions. But those who knew him noticed a difference. He seemed lighter, not because the past had changed, but because he'd stopped letting it steer his present. One evening, while sitting on a bench in a nearly empty park, an older man sat down beside him. They didn't speak at first, just watched the sunset paint the sky in soft purples and golds. After a while, the man said, "I saw that interview. My son and I haven't spoken in 12 years. I walked out when he was a teenager. Thought I was doing him a favor, getting out of his way, but I think I just ran from my own mess." Keanu didn't offer advice. He just said, "It's never too late to say you're sorry." The man nodded, tears in his eyes. "I don't know if he'll listen." "Maybe not," Keanu said gently, "but you'll know you tried. And that matters." They sat in silence for a long time after that, 2 strangers bound by nothing but shared regret and the faint hope of repair. Later, Keanu walked home under a sky full of stars. He thought about all the people carrying invisible weights, the kind no one else can see. He thought about how easy it is to believe you're the only one who feels lost, broken, or unworthy of love, but you're not. That was the real gift of that night on the talk show. Not the tears, not the confession, but the quiet ripple it created. One person's honesty became another's courage. A single moment of vulnerability became a lifeline for someone else. And in the end, that's what being human is about. Not perfection, not fame, not having all the answers. It's about showing up even when it hurts. It's about saying, "Me too," when someone else whispers, "Is it just me?" Keanu never planned to change the world. He just wanted to live his life with kindness. But sometimes that's exactly what changes everything. As he unlocked his front door, his dog greeted him with a wagging tail and a soft bark. Inside, the house was quiet, warm, full of the simple things that make a life: books, music, a half-finished cup of tea on the table. He sat down, scratched his dog behind the ears, and smiled. The story didn't need an ending. Because in real life, the best stories never really end. They just keep growing, one honest moment at a time.